Good morning, noon or night, and happy Daylight Savings Week. Today, we'll be talking about mental history. Mental health has always been a tricky obstacle to work around when it comes to managing the things I do every day, and even more so in the past year. Having to balance clinical depression and the quarantine depression we've all become very familiar with. So, without further ado, welcome to the Go Outside podcast, where I will be looking in-depth into the way our mental health care has evolved over the last 200 years. We begin our little journey in an overview of the mental health treatment pre-1900s, specifically women. Women were especially prone to psychiatric treatment and experimentation. In Victorian times, a woman could be considered unbalanced due to a variety of causes: menstruation, pregnancy, postpartum depression, and anxiety, for example. While some of these things are still considered mental illness, some of these symptoms of quote-unquote hysteria are simply emotions a woman normally experiences. People, especially women, who showed these signs of mental illness were placed in prison-like asylums, and at the time, women had little to no rights, and anything considered disobedience would be met with brutal punishments with little to no way out. Wire Mitchell was a physician known for neurology and more famously the rest cure, which was the most popular form of treatment at the time. Regimen of enforced bed rest, isolation, force-feeding, and massage consisted of this rest cure. The famous Charlotte Perkins Gilman suffered from postpartum depression and was many who were placed under Mitchell's rest cure. She described it as, quote, living as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you at all times, lie down an hour after each meal, have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never touch a pen, pencil, or brush as long as you live. Gilman stated that she, quote, came perilously near to losing my mind. The mental agony grew so unbearable that I would sit blankly, moving my head from side to side. This is a testimony from her autobiography, The Living of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. As we know today, most symptoms of depression should be combated with being creative and active, and anyone knows that the rest cure makes things worse for symptoms like depression. Treatment like this was very common during this period, and patients had no free will, and the only way out was to follow these treatments. By the late 1880s, the truth about treatments like this came out after the brave research of Nellie Bly, who posed as a mentally ill woman to get into an asylum, and took notes and drawings of all of her experiences for a shocking expose titled 10 Days in a Madhouse, which later turned into a best-selling book. She says, quote, the insane asylum on Blackwell's Island is a human rat trap. Easy to get in, but once you're there, impossible to get out. Her research helped bring reform to asylums all across the country. Now we move on to mental health treatment up to the 1960s. By the 1930s, the institutions began to think of new ways to study this erratic behavior and found different methods of treatment. An obvious influence in his research was Sigmund Freud, who began to study why humans acted the way that they did. However, his work took time and his quote-unquote talking cure did not seem to be working, so practitioners took matters into their own hands. Radical, and in today's terms, unethical treatments consisted of many different options, but the most famous and memorable were followed. The first, insulin-induced comas. Austrian-American neurologist Manfred Sackel introduced the insulin coma treatment in the United States in 1927, and the treatment was used extensively in the 40s and 50s. A physician would inject high levels of insulin into the patient, resulting in convulsions and an eventual coma. The patients would stay in a vegetative state for hours before being revived from this coma and thought to be cured of their madness. This treatment was mostly used on patients with schizophrenia and was often repeated daily for months at a time. This procedure was risky, and most times caused amnesia. Similar to insulin comas was metrazole shock therapy. Introduced in 1934 by Hungarian psychiatrist Ladislas von Medusa, metrazole shock therapy, much like insulin comas, was used to treat schizophrenia. Medusa discovered that metrazole, a new drug, caused seizure-like convulsions in patients and therefore quote-unquote shocking their brains out of the mental illness. Jeffrey E. Lieberman wrote in his book Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry, that patients sometimes suffered from injuries from convulsions. He says, quote, in 1939, an X-ray study at the New York Psychiatric Institute found that 43% of patients who underwent metrazole convulsive therapy experienced fractures in the vertebrae. Both the insulin comas and the metrazole shock therapy were outlawed in the late 40s. The third, lobotomies, was the most memorable and inhumane form of treatment on the mentally ill. This practice was invented in the 1930s by Portuguese neurologist Egas Muniz and was brought to the United States by Walter Freeman, who performed the first lobotomy in 1936. Surgeons would drill a pair of holes into the skull, either at the side or the top, and push a sharp instrument, a leucotome, into the brain. The surgeon would then use this to cut specific connections in the brain. The idea behind the lobotomy was to sever specific brain connections that caused specific neurological behaviors that doctors wanted to get rid of. This was successful in the idea that the lobotomy did get rid of bad behaviors, but also got rid of the patient's personality, memories, and usually resulted in an early death. Other famous treatments include electroshock therapy, which delivered high voltages to the brain to stop bad behaviors. This usually resulted in amnesia. And hydrotherapy, where patients were submerged in extremely hot or cold baths. This resulted in burns or frostbite. Medicine was also developing at the time, and many treatments proved to be dangerous. Opium and morphine came at the risk of addiction. Mercury, a toxic element, was used to try and control mania, and barbiturates simply put patients into a deep sleep, which was thought to help improve madness. This resulted in amnesia. By the 40s and 50s, the rate of hospitalizations was rising rapidly. More and more people needed mental health treatment and resources. This brought on the deinstitutionalization movement. At the same time, many chemists began to experiment with different medications that could help calm chemical imbalances, which are responsible for a large number of mental health disorders. As opposed to inhumane treatment and restraints, they decided a chemical restraint would work better. The most famous medical breakthrough was chlorpromazine, or more known as thorazine. It was synthesized in 1951 by Paul Charpentier in France, and was originally supposed to be used as an antihistamine. Its potential use in psychiatry was recognized by Henri Laborie, a French psychologist and surgeon after World War II. Laborie recognized that the medication induced calmness without the use of a sedative. As a result, Jean Delay and Pierre Denecker, two psychiatrists working at St. Anne's Hospital in Paris, used the medicine to treat inpatients, including people suffering with mania, schizophrenia, and anxiety. The introduction of medicine similar helped start the deinstitutionalization movement, moving patients out of asylums and back into communities with the new chemical restraint. Community Asians present day have worked for years to provide people with the help they need to manage their conditions all across without entering a facility for life. Thousands of inpatient hospitals, including Centennial Peaks where I stayed, all across the country work to rehabilitate those of every kind, including healthy treatments catered to every person. Research has progressed now more than ever, and the healthcare community works hard to provide therapies, hospitalizations, and medications to those who need it. So, I encourage all of you to go outside today. It's still a little snowy, but, have a good day.